Okay, so this is going to be a bit different. I'm going to be talking about heraldry and the relationship to writing systems. So just a bit of background. Encoding of sound is essential for true writing. Well before the alphabet, there were other systems in use, but basically all of them involved encoding sound. Okay, and writing is basically a symbol system for encoding language. Now, there are broader definitions. Some anthropologists, for example, like to have a sort of broader, more inclusive notion of writing. And, there's one textbook on writing systems by Powell, where he defines writing as a system of markings with conventional reference that communicates information. My view is that renders the term writing meaningless because every conventional symbol system has that property. So doesn't distinguish it from anything else. So obviously, one way that symbols are used to represent a particular language is that they relate to pronunciations that only make sense in that language. So, if you do this silly rebus thing, I can see you, that only works in English. Right? Okay. So, for it to be writing, there has to be some encoding phonology. So all true writing encodes sound. This is going to be very familiar stuff to many people here, right? So if you take Sumerian, for example, it was a mixed system where you had a symbol for bird and also a representation of the pronunciation. So something like Urin would be the word Hurin, meaning eagle, okay? And the same in Egyptian, you had similar things, the same in Chinese. This is modern Chinese, but even ancient Chinese had similar properties. And then in this case in Mayan, okay? So, if a symbol system encodes phonetics, is it therefore writing? Now, there have been hundreds, if not thousands, of symbol systems invented in history. I have a book that came out a couple of years ago where I discussed those, non-linguistic symbol systems and their relationship to writing. So, you can think of mathematical notation, musical notation, chess notation. I mean, there are tons and tons of different symbol systems. Now, most of the above do not typically encode phonetics or phonology. But, sometimes it does. Sometimes you find in apparently non-linguistic symbol systems some kind of cues that relate to the phonetics or the phonology of a particular language. So let's do a little thought experiment. And the reason this is, relevant is because, one reason it's relevant is that if you look at, sorry, I had a cold, so my voice is hopefully going to survive for the next 20 or so minutes. If you look at an ancient symbol system, so let's say you've got some ancient piece of pottery or a piece of clay that has some symbols on it, and let's say you have it was clear that it was conventional in the sense that it would convey information of some kind. And let's say that you think you have evidence that it also sometimes conveys phonetic information. So the question is, maybe they have these rebuses, right? Like my silly "I can see you" example. Is that writing? Put it another way, Sabine Hyland actually asked this question, and this is what prompted this whole project to some extent. Is if there's one rebus in a symbol system, does it count as writing? Okay. You might ask, well, does it look like writing? And when we think of writing, whether it be the Greek alphabet or, most modern systems, right, they tend to be kind of linear in the sense that, they can be arranged in, left to right, right to left, top to bottom, whatever. There are writing systems and things that have been claimed to be writing systems that are quite non-linear. And one example is Aztec writing, which so I'm going to make a lot of reference to Gordon Whitaker's work on this, where first of all, it's rather limited what could be written, apparently, at least from the extant data that we have. It was mostly names. There were some acceptance examples. I'll show you an example later on. It's not very linear, as we will see. It's heavily semasiographic, meaning that most of the signs represent meanings directly. They're very iconic. They don't actually tie it to the Aztec or Nahuatl language. Phonography, that is the writing of sounds, in most cases, not in all cases, but is limited to writing postposition, so grammatical markers. We'll see examples of that. And the other odd property of writing, this is kind of an orthogonal issue, but it's something that's sort of interest, is that it's kind of like seems like a very limited writing system. It has been claimed both by Whitaker, and also there's a paper recently that has made a lot of press where they've argued that the system actually goes back 1,000 years to the graphic system of Teotihuacan. And if that's the case, then it means it kind of retained this very kind of simple set of properties. It didn't really develop into kind of a full-blown writing system for 1,000 years, despite the fact that there were civilizations around it which had full-blown writing, like the Mayans, for example. Anyway, that's, as I say, a somewhat of an issue. Let's do some examples. So one example is this I thing here, okay, these guys here. And this was, so the Nahuatl word for I was something like istri, and this was used to represent the post position, isco. So like this is in front of the arms. Now notice arms is represented by arms, but this is representing the sound, okay? Or another example is the teeth. So the word for teeth is plantri, okay? And that's used to represent the post-position plan, by the X. Okay, so a lot of place names in Nahuatl are, by the X or near the X or in the X. That kind of those are typical ways of forming names. My favorite example here is Awakatlan, so by the avocados. Okay? So there's a nice picture of an avocado tree, and it's got teeth on it. Okay. And you see these are not very linear arrangements, right? You kind of construct these things in rather non-linear fashion. Here's just one more example. So the word Nahuatl for the language actually comes from this word Nahuatl, meaning clear and pleasant sound. And this is kind of like a little speech bubble, kind of their version of the speech bubble. And that was used to represent the postposition Nahuac. Okay, it's a similar kind of sound. Okay, so then again, you see, the here, here, and here. Okay. As I said, it's mostly used to write names, personal names, place names, things like that. There are in the extant corpus, there are the occasional sentence. So this is one example where it's, in the year 8, Akatl, the great temple, was inaugurated at Tenochtitlan, okay? Now, I'm not going to go through all this in detail, but, there's just, for example, 8 is represented by 8 circles. That's pretty iconic. The year sign is interestingly represented by the word for turquoise, which happens to be, or the color turquoise, where the word for turquoise happens to be homophonous or very close to the word for year. The Great Temple is simply represented by having a big picture of a temple. And the way you represented things like big in Aztec was simply make a bigger one. So it's very iconic. And you can see most of this stuff, there is some phonography in here. Most of it is fairly iconic, does not particularly tie you to the language. Okay, so let's go back to our avocado example here. What's the difference between this and examples like that? Okay, so this is, of course, a familiar kind of thing to many people, European heraldry. This may be less familiar. This is Kamon, a Japanese version of heraldry. Okay, and I'm going to talk a lot about these two systems. Okay, well, most of Nahuatl writing doesn't tie to Nahuatl. So this avocado tree, I mean, that could be interpreted as avocado no matter what language you speak. But go back. But the teeth, obviously, to get clan from that, you have to know the language. Okay. Similarly, most of heraldic symbology does not tie to a particular language. European heraldry, in particular, was used across a wide range of countries, although it did differ in details. Japanese heraldry, well, that was basically used in Japan, but most of the symbology there doesn't particularly tie it to Japanese or to any other language. So you can ask for what linguistic information is encoded and how. We'll see in both these systems there is linguistic information that can be encoded. And you can ask about how much of this is phonetic, and we'll see examples of that. And obviously there are differences in layout. Well, so there's the way the Nahuatl system work in obviously there's kind of graphical design elements here, symmetry and things like that you don't typically find in writing systems. So there are those kinds of differences. Okay. So let me just briefly go, since I assume that most people are not necessarily familiar with this, I just go through some of the brief elements of heraldry. So they break down as follows. One is the sort of basic issue is colors and furs. Okay, so things like these are colors, these are so-called metals, and these are so-called furs. Okay, there's various so-called ordinaries, so things like the fess, the pale, the bend, and so forth. These are standardly found in across different across different arms. There's the so-called charges, which are typically in European heraldry animals, so they can also be plants. Sometimes they're mythical animals. And then there's the important in heraldry is so-called marshalling, and that's, for example, used to represent marriage. So one way you represent that the two families are joined in marriage is you take the male shield and the female shield and you combine them by so-called impalement. Okay. So there is a language of blazon which is used to describe. So I'll just just for example here this is ermine, which is this, on a chief indented, that's the little teethy things, and then a scallop or. So basically, gules means red, or means gold. So this is a way, formal way of describing that. Okay. Okay. What about Camon? So there are enclosures. Some common enclosures are things like mare, or yukiwa, the snow ring, or this kiko. If you know the kikoman. Soy sauce, that's that. Okay. There's formal descriptions of these things. So this is a descending wisteria, or this is a hemp leaf. This is a 5-leaf bamboo grass, and so on and so forth. So they have, again, like blazon, they have a kind of formal description system. Okay. This is some examples of that. So, by the way, these things are very popular in Japan for, online, you go on Amazon and things, and you can actually sort of get these things right. This is so Tokarashi Tomoe is the hot pepper swirl. But here's, for example, this is 2 crossed eagle leaves inside a ring. Okay. This one is probably familiar if you cover it red as the Mitsubishi logo. Okay. But this is actually a Camon. That means it will come on. Okay. Okay, so to get to the main point here, one of the things you find that's very common, or is widespread, I should say, in heraldry is what's called canting arms, or arms that are somehow reminiscent of the name. Okay. In French, it's called un parlant, and it has various names in other languages, but basically, an example would be someone's named Hog to have a picture of a boar's head, or if someone is named Cockburn to have pictures of cocks, of chickens, and so on and so forth. These things can be cross-linguistic. So this guy's name is Rota, and this only works if you know the Latin word. Right? And this one is particularly arcane. Right? This is Beatrice of York, and if you see here, there's the little bees at the top there, be thrice. They can get a little bit strange. Actually, is Pastor Beau in his book points out that unlike common, where actually insects are not uncommon, they're rather rare in heraldry, but when they do occur, they're typically for this kind of purpose. Okay. Okay. What about in Camon? So I'm not going to go through all of these in detail, but one of the things we'll see is that there's a lot less punning in Camon and a lot more direct reference to the kanji, the characters that are used to write the name. So, but let's start with some examples of puns. I'll just give this example. So, yukiwa ni asa no ha. So this is in a snow ring, a hemp leaf. This is for the family name Asa. And the thing to notice here is that this writing of this name is not the same as that there. They're homophones, but it's not the same, written form. Okay, so there's an example of apparently a pun, like the canting arms that we saw before. On the other hand, probably more common is to have a representation that, if you were to write the word for it, would have the same character as the family name. So, example would be for the Kasai family, which literally Kasai is one of those bamboo hats, traditional bamboo hats. E means well. Okay, So this is this particular one for that family would be Iket and Ikasa. So in a well frame, a hat. Okay, and this well, actually, both of the elements of the name are kind of referenced here: the well part and the hat part. Okay, but this I wouldn't call this a real pun, right? Because this is actually, actually references the name in some more direct way. Okay. Now, there's lots of historical reasons for choosing different motifs. In heraldry, for example, well, I'm not going to go into all the details here, but basically, there's for the arms of this particular Lane family from King's Bromley. There was a legend about one of the heiresses having saved King Charles II after the Battle of Worcester by hiding him as a servant and transporting him on a horse, and so they got this horse motif as part of not as part of the main shield, but as part of the top part. Okay. In the case of Camon, one example from Dao's book about Japanese Camon is this is the arms or the Camon of the Hojo family, which was the family that ran the first shogunate, the Kamakura shogunate, and the first shogun of that dynasty, Hojo Tokimasa, supposedly had this dream where he saw some sea creature or female, sprite or whatever out of the sea, and after she left, she turned into a serpent and left 3 of her scales behind, and then that you get these are the stylized scales that you get there. Okay, so there's lots of reasons, and just to sort of bring this a little closer to home, right? So things can be sort of more semantically related. So it's very common in university shields to have a book of some kind. So in the case of Cambridge, you have the Bible right in the center here. Or if you go to the Cambridgeshire shield, right, there's a reference to the river Cam by these wavy lines. And in the Cambridge City arms, it's a rather more directly a counting arm because you have the bridge and the water. Okay, so you get these various ways of alluding to names. Okay, so why use counting arms? Why do people? Why would you? Well, imagine. I'm going to apologize for the cheesy AI-generated art here, but if your commanding officer looks like that, right? You need some way to identify them in battle, and one way to do that is to. And if you can't read, right, it's no good writing the word out. You probably have to have something that's a little bit more, calls to mind the name. And so having a counting arm, if it can somehow relate to the name, that's a good way to get it. So if the guy's name happened to be Hog or Baron or whatever, we can have a hog's head or a bear, and that would sort of give that, immediacy. So you could say that counting arms serve some of the functions of writing, right? Because they kind of relate to a particular language or a particular pronunciation of a name. And while you wouldn't probably say it is writing, you would say that you could say that it has some of the functions of writing. Okay, so how prevalent are these things? And well, it depends upon the region. So this study by the French heraldicist Pastourel claims that 20 to 25% of arms use counts. This is European heraldry. Not all of these involve puns. Some people are a little bit loose about the terminology, but he also says that higher percentages are claimed for German-speaking countries. So in German they're called Betende Waffen. Again, like talking arms or whatever. There's apparently extensive use in Russian heraldry, the so-called Glasny Gerb, for city or regional arms. And people have claimed that almost all the arms used in earlier times were phonetic in character. These are claims that have been made. Okay. Now, part of the problem in assessing these claims is that sometimes the associations may be lost. The names have changed. And there's a similar issue with Camon. So the family may have been part of a clan. They got the Camon from the clan, but that family now has a different name. That's quite common. Sometimes, also, by the way, just historically, the names were derived from the arms rather than the other way around. So the family took their name from the arms, rather than the arms being taken on the case of the family. And of course, multiple languages may also be involved in counting arms. We saw this here. So you can't just necessarily look at English. If you're doing, say, British heraldry, you may also have to consider that they may be punning in Latin or whatever. Okay, so I wanted to get some sort of general assessment of the relative frequency of canting in heraldry versus its equivalents in common. And these are going to be very approximate numbers, okay? I'm basing this purely on Scottish heraldry in this case, because there's this nice online data set of the Mitchell rolls from the Heraldry Society of Scotland, and they have 2,863 name arms association. And so they look like things like this, you know, Sire, Edward, Balliol, Roy, Descos, right? Obviously it's kind of garbled French in this case. You know, or a lion rampant with a double treasure florid, counter florid gules. Okay, so you have the description. It doesn't have the picture of the arms, we have the description, which is good enough for sort of detecting puns. So, being as we are now in the AI age, right, I decided to use a large language model to help me with this because I'm too tired to go through all of these by hand, it will take too long. And basically, it had to do some normalization of the name, so it had to sort of change this was presumably the count of Fife, right? So they had to try to do that normalization and to find possible cats. Now, one of the things that everybody knows about large language models is that they hallucinate, and this is a very ripe area for them to hallucinate. So I had to go through and check the results by hand and see whether I actually believed the association. So it was still a fair amount of work. So I basically prompted the large language model. Well, I won't go into all the gory details here, basically just explaining what I wanted it to do and so on and so forth, give it a few examples of the kinds of things it might do. And the result after cleaning this up was to get the names, what is potentially the normalized name. So, Sire de Frisell is probably Sir Fraser, and this is probably a weird spelling of Stuart and so forth. And then compare the blazon. And then, well, for example, in this case, the galley is probably actually a pun on the Gael pun of Sudaga. Okay, so this is actually the herald that is used, or the arms that is used, or part of the arms that's used for this family. Okay, so I did the same thing for camel. So I used a couple of different sources. The first is this, again, online set of unique family names, along with the associated camel, which have a description with them. And I did kind of so here's an example. This is the family name Silka, and it has the crest within a ring, two yin yang cross wild geese. So that's this guy here. Okay? Believe it or not, those are wild geese. I mean, it's just conventional looking thing. And they're crossed because they're facing each other. So, okay, so I did the prompting in this case in Japanese, but I'll give the translation of that. It's a little bit small here, but one of the things I needed to explain to the system is that there's a distinction between a pun and something which is simply based on having the same kanji. Okay, so for example, the Sakurai family, for example, that if you have a cherry sakura in the crest, that doesn't really count as a pun because it would be the same kanji in that case. But on the other hand, if you have the Kuma clan, which happens to use this character, and I apologize for the size here, and you have the a bear, a bear symbol Kuma, which is Kuma also in Japanese. That's a homophone. It's not the same kanji, so that would count as a pun. Okay. Okay, so just for example, this is some things that came out. So this is actually, oh, by the way, in Kamon, it's much more common to find actual kanji as part of the simple stuff. Those are actually less interesting from my point of view, but this is just one example where that occurs. So this is the Hayashi family. So this is literally means wood, as in a bunch of trees. But in this case, it's, within a ring, a sort of a squarish Hayashi kanji, okay? But this is perhaps a somewhat more interesting example. This is Haneda, so it happens to be the name of the airport, into one of the airports of Tokyo, but this is the literally feather field, okay, and within a ring crossed hawk feathers, okay, so that seems to be a case where there's a relationship with the kanji. It's not really a pun. Okay, I also used some data from this book, the Kamon Daijiten, which this case is arranged by the crest, not by the family name, so it's kind of going in the opposite direction. I again was interested in sort of detecting the relations. So here's again, for example, the name Fujitsu, which has the wisteria character in it, and Sagari Fuji, the descending wisteria. So this is, let's believe it or not, that's a wisteria. This is the, I think we saw this one before. This is the this kind of, so this is cases where it's the same kanji, if you like, if you were to write that in the description of this, you would use the same kanji as in the name. In this case, it's more of a semantic association because take, the bamboo, is not the same as sasa, bamboo grass, but there's a sort of an association between the two because they're both kinds of bamboo. And then finally, a real pun is a case like, for example, the name Asano, where the asa hemp character is used, or the asa hemp emblem is used, I should say. In this case, I kind of ignored the cases where there were kanji in the crest themselves. By the way, one of the things about this book is he arranged everything that has the same sort of basic crest is in the same bin. So these are all examples of the Kashiwa crest. There's a whole bunch of them, hundreds of them, but they all sort of fall into the same bin in his classification. Okay, so again, some cleaned up examples. So these are a couple of cases of actual, real, genuine puns, right? So this is the crest has a yuri, which is a lily. The family name is this yuri. It's not the same kanji at all. Or here's another example. This one's kind of cute. So the family name is Kani, okay, and they use the Kani crab as they actually have a crab element, okay. So just to give you some rough statistics. Now, one thing to bear in mind, I'll say this again at the end, but these are probably underestimates, right? Because we don't have, we're going to miss cases. There are all sorts of reasons we've already described why you may not be able to see them by looking at the contemporary names or the contemporary descriptions of the crests, because then maybe the family name changed and things like that. So, and of course, the large language model obviously is going to miss things, sure. And I wanted to err on the side of, underestimate rather than overestimate. But in the case of heraldry, it seemed about 15% in these set of Scottish arms seem to involve canting arms. Okay. If you look from the second set that I was told, I mentioned, which goes from crests to or motifs, if you like, to family names, it seems like there's some relationship in over 40% of them. What that means is that for a crest or a motif, there is some, at least one family name that has some relationship. So it's a fairly low bar, if you think about it. And of these, only about 8.9% involve actual puns, okay, that I could detect. If you go the other way from names into motifs, so again, this is the online data set, it's much smaller, maybe a little over 3% have some relationship, and less than 1% are genuine, seem to be genuine puns. Okay, so obviously, you don't get this kind of punning in the majority of cases, despite what the claims in the literature are, and even given that this is an underestimate, it doesn't look as if the majority of heralds necessarily are involve of these kinds of canting arms. But again, I will emphasize that this is probably an underestimate. And for whatever reason, true puns seem to be relatively rare in common compared to the case of heraldry. I'll suggest a possible reason for that momentarily. But just to summarize, I already said this. I already said that. And one possible reason for this, for the fact that it's less common in in the Japanese case and the European case is that in the case of Japanese, names usually have some obvious meaning. I don't claim that these are necessarily historically accurate, but if you have the name Fujitsu, for example, well, that literally means wisteria thought, okay? And, you know, so it's very kind of interpretable, right? It's very obvious what it means. And maybe the most direct way to trigger that kind of association would simply have a wisteria motif, right? Just to use the same word, you know, something which, if described in writing, would be use the same kanji, that would work fine. If again your point is to kind of make your name obvious to somebody who can't read, having a wisteria motif would sort of get you that. Whereas, you know, the etymology of a lot of Western names is rather unclear. I have no idea what the etymology of my name Sproat is, for example. Just don't know. I mean, there's theories, but you know, if I had to come up with a meaning for it, I couldn't do it. Whereas in the case of Fujitsu and most other Japanese names, you can. Now, interestingly, I'm not sure, I don't have enough data to support this as a general claim, but names that are less obvious, have a less obvious meaning, seem to be more conducive to puns in Kamo. So for example, this name Kani, well, if you interpret the Chinese characters, it doesn't mean much. It's something like, I don't know, able and child. It's very strange kind of meaning. So it doesn't have any obvious semantic content to it. So in that case, it sort of makes sense to use Kani crab because, you know, it gets the sound. Okay, so as I said before, you know, counting kind of triggers the name in a way that's instantly recognizable to somebody who is illiterate, and therefore this serves some of the functions of writing. So if you have a symbol system that encloses some phoneticism in it, let's go back to our hypothetical thought experiment at the beginning, maybe, you know, that isn't enough to argue that it's writing because there could be all sorts of other things that are going on. Okay, so how is Aztec different from heraldry? Phonographic elements are necessary for something to be considered writing, but they're not necessarily sufficient. One of the differences is that heraldic elements tend to be rather ad hoc. I mean, you could say there are kind of conventions. Maybe, you know, people have bear type of sound in their name, might get a bear, but it's not as if that's a hard and fast rule. Whereas in the case of Aztec hieroglyphs, they tend to be much more conventionalized. We saw the examples, the tlantli, the teeth, representing the post-position tlan, and that's quite, you know, apparently quite systematic. And maybe the most significant point, though, is that in Aztec, these are used to represent closed class items, that is, you know, function words and so on and so forth, whereas in the case of heraldry, they're all representing names, okay? So probably, you know, heraldry shouldn't be considered writing, although some people use the term loosely. So Pastoureau, in one of his books, one of his papers, refers to it as une écriture en image, but you know, you could take that as kind of a loose notion of the word writing. So I guess the conclusion is that, you know, one needs to be careful in asserting that something is writing simply on the basis of a few possible phonographs in the system. And just to summarize, you know, obviously there are several kind of research questions. One is the difference in layout, which I alluded to at the beginning. Can you quantify that difference in layout? As I said, you know, crests, because of their nature, tend to be rather symmetric, artistic, whereas in the case of Aztec writing, it was rather less symmetric. That could be one difference. And then the other issue is conventionality that I mentioned. You know, you could presumably quantify the degree to which phonographs become conventionalized, which is one of the kind of prerequisites for a system to develop full writing, into full writing. And so here's some of the references. And again, if you're interested in the slides, you can scan that in. And done.